Victor Prescott ran his hands along the velvet seatbacks, feeling the imported fabric catch against his palms. Late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of his nearly completed opera house, catching dust motes that swirled in the November air. Above, 3 workers balanced on scaffolding, securing the final pieces of the crystal chandelier shipped all the way from Philadelphia, crated in straw and prayers. "Hand me that wrench," one worker called. "Careful now, thing probably cost more than my house." "More than all our houses," another muttered. Victor pretended not to hear. He moved through the empty rows, imagining them filled with Silverton's mining elite, champagne glasses catching gaslight, the rustle of silk gowns. This building would prove what he'd known since striking silver 3 years ago, that wealth meant nothing without refinement, that Silverton could be more than muddy streets and rough camps. "Mr. Prescott." His architect descended from the balcony. Blueprints rolled under one arm. "The acoustics are perfect, best I've achieved west of Denver." "Excellent. And the stage curtains, arriving next week, burgundy velvet, and as you specified." Victor nodded, satisfaction settling warm in his chest. The opera house would open in 4 weeks, just time enough to confirm performers from San Francisco, print programs on quality stock, extend invitations to investors from as far as Boston. Culture elevated civilization. These miners who whispered behind his back simply didn't understand. Through the west window, Victor caught a glimpse of canvas tents dotting the hillside above town. The schoolyard, such as it was. He turned deliberately away, focusing instead on the chandelier's progress. "Heard Mary O'Connor's been collecting signatures," one of the workers said. Voice carrying in the empty space. "Petition for school funding." "Good luck with that," another replied. "Kids learning in those tents while we're installing crystal. Whole town's talking. They just don't see the bigger picture," the first worker said, though his tone suggested he didn't quite believe his own words. Victor cleared his throat. The workers fell silent, focusing intently on the chandelier mounting. He walked to the front entrance, examining the carved oak doors. Let them talk. In 5 years, when Eastern capital flowed into Silverton because investors had attended performances here, when the town doubled in size and prosperity, they'd understand. Culture attracted wealth. Wealth built everything else. The opera house would be Silverton's crown jewel. That's what the architect had called it. And Victor believed him absolutely. He stood in the doorway as evening settled over the mountains, imagining opening night gaslight gleaming, music rising, the scent of expensive perfume mixing with mountain air. His vision. Realized his monument to what this rough town could become. Victor buttoned his coat against the cold and headed home, and already composing the letter he'd write to his daughter. Catherine would be so proud. Her finishing school education in Denver proved the value he placed on refinement, on culture. She'd understand the opera house in ways these provincial miners never could. The canvas tents on the hillside disappeared into gathering darkness as he walked. He didn't look back. Mary O'Connor stood in Victor Prescott's mine office, petition held in both hands. 50 signatures, miners' wives, shopkeepers, even 3 of the saloon owners. The paper felt substantial, important. Her fingers bore chalk stains that wouldn't wash completely clean no matter how hard she scrubbed. "Miss O'Connor," Victor gestured to a chair across from his massive oak desk. "I can guess why you're here." "Then you know winter's coming and 20 children are still learning in canvas tents." Mary remained standing. "No books beyond the 3 we share. No slates, no proper shelter." Victor leaned back, fingers steepled. "I admire your dedication." "Truly. But surely you understand that Silverton's future depends on attracting Eastern capital. The opera house will, Mr. Prescott, with respect, civilization doesn't begin with opera houses." Mary set the petition on his desk. "It begins with literacy, with children who can read and calculate and think. And culture elevates society. Miss O'Connor, the opera house will bring investors, create employment, demonstrate that Silverton has moved beyond its frontier origins." Victor didn't touch the petition. "Surely you see that serves the greater good. I see children teaching each other because I'm the only instructor. I see families sharing one reader among 3 households. I see..." temporary conditions. Victor's tone remained pleasant but firm. Once the opera house establishes our reputation, resources will flow naturally. Rising tide, as they say. And in the meantime, you're doing admirable work with limited resources. Character building. One might argue. Mary felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Prescott, these children deserve better than character-building poverty. They deserve books and warmth and a teacher who isn't stretched impossibly thin. I'm sure they do. But I've committed my resources to a project that will benefit the entire community long-term. Victor stood, signaling the meeting's end. I'm sorry. Miss O'Connor, truly, but the Opera House represents Silverton's future. Education represents civilization's foundation. Everything else is just... Mary searched for words that wouldn't sound like pleading. Performance. Something flickered across Victor's face, irritation, perhaps, or recognition that she'd struck close to something he preferred not to examine. I appreciate your perspective, but my decision stands. Mary picked up the petition, the paper now feeling insubstantial in her hands. 50 signatures, 50 families believing she could make Victor Prescott see reason. She'd failed them. The offer to perform at the Opera House opening stands. You know, Victor said as she reached the door, a reading from the students, perhaps demonstrate the fruit of your labors. Mr. Prescott, the fruit of my labors is children who can read despite having almost nothing. Not performance pieces for mining elite entertainment. She left before he could respond, walking out into morning sunshine that felt too bright against her frustration. The petition went into her satchel with her 3 precious books and the bundle of slate scraps she'd collected from the mining office refuse heap. Victor returned to the stack of Opera House invoices on his desk programs, performers' fees, champagne orders, everything precisely planned, everything accounted for. He barely noticed Mary O'Connor walking up the hill toward the canvas tents, her chalk-stained fingers gripping her satchel. He had an opera house to complete. December, gaslight made the chandelier crystals dance like captured stars. Victor stood near the opera house entrance, accepting congratulations from men in evening dress, women in silk gowns imported from San Francisco and beyond. The air smelled of expensive perfume and champagne, of success and vindication. Magnificent achievement, Prescott, said Thomas Hayes, mine owner from 2 valleys over. Heard about it as far as Durango. This puts Silverton on the map. Culture elevates us all, Victor replied, the phrase becoming comfortable through repetition. He'd used it in his opening remarks, in the printed program, in conversation throughout the evening. On stage, a soprano from Denver performed Verdi, her voice soaring into the acoustic perfection Victor's architect had promised. The audience sat rapt, mining elite, invited investors from the East, even the territorial governor's representative, everything Victor had envisioned. Realized in velvet and crystal and perfect notes. Your daughter couldn't attend, Hayes asked. Still in Denver, finishing school, but I've written her every detail. She'll be tremendously proud. Through the tall windows, Victor could see Silverton spread below, lights twinkling in saloons and homes, smoke rising from 100 chimneys. His opera house crowned the town like a jewel in a rough setting, proof that civilization had arrived, that this silver camp had transformed into something worthy of respect. The soprano finished to thunderous applause. Victor joined in, satisfaction warm as whiskey in his chest. That same evening, Mary O'Connor taught by kerosene lamp in the canvas tent, her breath visible in December air. 20 children crowded onto rough benches, wrapped in whatever coats and blankets their families could spare. The inadequate stove in the corner did its best, but wind found every gap in the canvas walls. Sarah. Help your brother with those sums, Mary said, voice steady despite exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. The lamp oil was running low. She could smell it burning thin, see the flame guttering. 12-year-old Sarah moved to sit beside her younger brother, guiding his hand across a slate scrap. See, you carry the one here. I got it. The boy's face lit up. It's like you said, Miss O'Connor, numbers tell stories. They do indeed. Mary pulled her shawl tighter. The canvas rippled in a gust of wind, snow beginning to tick against the fabric. Let's work through one more problem together. Then you'll practice at home. We only have one lamp at home." A girl named Emma said, "Ma says to save the oil. Then practice by firelight if you have it, or in your head while you're doing chores." Mary managed to smile. "Mathematics doesn't require light, only thinking." The children nodded seriously. These young scholars who treated learning like treasure because they understood scarcity. They shared slates without being asked, helped younger students sound out words, memorized lessons because paper was too precious to waste on notes. When the lamp oil finally ran too low to continue safely, Mary released them into the December night. "Careful going home, and remember, practice makes permanent," they chorused, the saying she'd taught them. Mary watched them scatter toward their homes, small figures disappearing into darkness. Through the valley below, she could see the opera house blazing with light, hear music drifting on the wind. That building could have held every child in Silverton, kept them warm, given them space to learn properly. Instead, it housed champagne and Verdi for people who already had everything. Mary extinguished the lamp, packed her 3 books carefully, and walked home through snow that was falling harder now. Behind her, the tent rippled in wind, canvas wearing thin in places to ropes straining against stakes. Tomorrow she'd teach again. She always did, in the valley. The opera house glittered like something from a dream. Victor Prescott standing at its heart, certain he'd built civilization. January deepened its cold grip on Silverton. Mary arrived at the tent school each morning to find canvas stiff with frost, ropes brittle enough to snap. She'd taken to patching tiers with any scrap fabric she could find: old curtains, worn blankets, pieces of oilcloth that at least kept some wind out. The children came with chilblained hands, their breath making clouds in the tent's perpetual chill. The stove glowed red, trying to heat the space, but canvas held warmth about as well as a sieve held water. "Miss O'Connor, I brought firewood," 10-year-old Thomas said, arms full of split pine. His father worked Victor Prescott's mine. 16 hours underground for wages that barely covered rent. "Bless you. Thomas, stack it here." Mary took the wood gratefully. The community brought what it could: firewood, lamp oil when they had extra, occasionally a donated book that made her want to weep with gratitude. "How do you spell civilization?" Emma asked. Slate poised, Mary spelled it out, watching Emma's careful letters. The girl was 13, should have been learning rhetoric and literature, not struggling with basic spelling and freezing canvas. But she worked with fierce concentration, the way all these children did, as if education was air they'd been denied. "Good. Now use it in a sentence," Emma thought. Then wrote, "Civilization means everybody can read." Orchestrated narrative contrast between comfort and hardship, advancing toward character introduction. Good progress. I'm maintaining the emotional authenticity and period details. Let me continue with the chapter, showing the contrast between Victor's comfort and the children's struggles, then move into Catherine's arrival. Mary felt something catch in her throat. Perfect. Emma, absolutely perfect. Older students helped younger ones automatically, now Sarah teaching arithmetic. Thomas helping with reading. Emma guiding spelling. They'd created their own system of mutual aid. These children who understood that sharing was survival. At midday, they shared whatever food they'd brought: cornbread, cold beans, occasionally an apple. Mary watched them divide portions with mathematical precision, making sure everyone got equal shares. "Miss O'Connor," Sarah asked during their brief lunch, "why doesn't Mr. Prescott help us? Everyone says he's rich." Mary chose her words carefully. "Mr. Prescott believes he's helping Silverton by building the opera house. He thinks culture will bring money to town." "But we're already here," Thomas said, logical as always. "We need help now." "Yes, you do." Mary couldn't argue with that. "But sometimes people see what they want to see." That same day, Victor reviewed opera house accounts in his warm mine office. 3 performances booked through February. Interest from Denver investors. Inquiries about purchasing shares in Silverton's mining operations. The opera house was working exactly as he'd planned. A letter from Catherine sat on his desk, pages of elegant script describing her final term at finishing school. Her studies in literature and music and French. Victor read with paternal pride, imagining her returning to Silverton in a few weeks, educated and refined. "Father," she wrote, "I'm grateful for the education you've provided. I hope to use it in service of our community." Victor smiled. Perhaps she'd organize literary readings at the Opera House, or teach piano to daughters of Silverton's growing elite. A young woman of her refinement would elevate the town's cultural standing even further. He didn't connect her literacy to the petition Mary O'Connor had brought. Didn't think about the tent school where children learned with frozen fingers and failing light. That evening, the Opera House hosted its New Year's gala. Victor stood in the warmth and gaslight, surrounded by success, watching snow fall outside tall windows. The chandelier caught and fractured light into rainbows. Champagne bubbled in crystal glasses. Somewhere up the hill, children were learning in canvas and cold, teaching each other by kerosene smoke, building civilization from scraps. Victor didn't know, didn't see, didn't question, not yet. Victor Prescott stepped off the afternoon stage with 3 trunks and a year's worth of refinement that felt suddenly heavy. Silverton looked smaller than she remembered: muddy streets, rough buildings, mountains crowding close. The Opera House rose above it all, elegant and incongruous as a pearl on burlap. Catherine. Her father waited with the carriage, pride evident in his posture. "Welcome home, my dear Ben. You look overdressed for Silverton," she smiled, softening the observation. "Denver polish doesn't quite fit here does it? Nonsense. You'll elevate the town's standards." Victor helped her into the carriage. "Wait until you see the Opera House. Everything I described in my letters, realized perfectly." They drove through town, Catherine watching familiar streets with eyes changed by absence. More tents on the hillside than she remembered, more children in patched clothing, more exhaustion in women's faces. "How are the schools?" she asked. "Schools?" Victor frowned. "You mean the tent situation that's temporary? Mary O'Connor does her best, though I suggested cultural programming might serve the children better than... She's still teaching in tents." Catherine turned to face her father. "In January. These things take time. Once the Opera House establishes, well, Father." Catherine's tone was gentle but firm. "It's January. Children are learning in canvas." "Yes. Well..." Victor looked uncomfortable. "There are larger economic considerations. The Opera House will benefit everyone eventually." Catherine said nothing more, but something had shifted in her chest, recognition of a gap between her father's words and their weight. That evening, Victor showed her through the Opera House with obvious pride, pointing out acoustic details, imported fabrics, the crystal chandelier. Catherine admired it all appropriately. But her mind kept returning to canvas tents and January cold. "I'd like to volunteer," she said over dinner, "at the school. The tent school." Victor set down his fork. "My dear, that's hardly appropriate for someone of your education." "My education should serve someone, shouldn't it?" "Of course. I thought you might organize literary readings at the Opera House, or perhaps teach piano too." "I'd like to help Miss O'Connor first." Catherine kept her voice pleasant. "See what the community needs." Victor hesitated, then nodded. "If it pleases you, though don't be surprised if you find the situation less dire than rumor suggests." Catherine found the tent school 2 days later, following directions from 3 different townspeople who all gave them with identical expressions of carefully controlled anger. Inside the canvas, 20 children sat on rough benches in their coats, breath visible. Mary O'Connor stood before a board balanced on sawhorses, chalk in hand, teaching grammar with exhausted precision. "Excuse me." Catherine stood in the tent entrance, suddenly aware of her fine wool coat, her leather gloves, her warm boots. Mary turned. "Yes. I'm Victor Prescott. I'd like to help, if you'll have me." Silence fell across the tent. Children stared. Mary's chalk-stained fingers tightened on the piece in her hand. "Your father's daughter," she said finally. "Yes." Catherine met her gaze steadily. "I know what he chose. I'm here anyway." Something shifted in Mary's expression. "Can you teach arithmetic?" "Yes." "Then welcome." Mary gestured to the smaller children. Thomas and his group need help with multiplication. Catherine removed her fine gloves, felt canvas cold seep through her dress, saw intelligent faces turn toward her with cautious hope. She knelt beside Thomas, saw slate scraps and careful numbers, saw education building itself from nothing. "Let's start with your sevens," she said, and picked up a piece of chalk. The dust felt strange on her fingers, strange and somehow right when she returned home that evening. Hands stained with chalk. Victor noticed but misunderstood. "Charitable work suits you, he said, very appropriate for a young lady of refinement. Catherine looked at her hands, at the chalk that wouldn't wash completely clean, and said nothing. She returned to the tent school the next day, and the next, returned until the chalk stains became permanent, until she stopped noticing the cold, until she understood exactly what her father had chosen and what it had cost. The February storm hit during afternoon lessons. Mary felt the wind shift, saw canvas walls billow inward, heard ropes creak against stakes. "Children, we're finishing early today." She kept her voice calm. "Pack up carefully and—" A gust hit the tent like a fist. The center pole groaned, canvas straining. Mary moved toward the entrance. "Everyone out, now, orderly." The crack was sharp as a gunshot. The center pole splintered, splitting halfway up. Canvas collapsed inward, heavy fabric falling onto benches, onto children. "Get them out!" Mary grabbed canvas, pulling fabric off small bodies. Older students were already helping, lifting younger ones, shouting for people to crawl toward light. Catherine fought through collapsing canvas from the far side where she'd been working with Emma's group. Here, parents arrived, drawn by screams. By the sight of tent collapse, they pulled children free, crying, frightened. Some bleeding where pole splinters had caught them. Mary counted heads frantically, checking each child, finding injuries but no deaths. Thomas had a gash across his forehead. Emma's arm hung at a wrong angle, clearly broken. 5 others showed cuts and bruises, shock making them shake. "Get them inside somewhere," Mary commanded. "The mercantile, the church, and anywhere warm." People moved immediately, responding to her authority. Catherine wrapped her coat around a crying girl, lifted her bodily, ran toward town. Others followed with injured children. Mary stood in the wreckage, canvas settling around splintered poles like a shroud. The inadequate stove lay on its side, fire scattered but contained. 1 month ago, she'd patched this canvas. 1 week ago, she'd tightened these ropes. It had been a matter of time. News spread through Silverton faster than the storm winds. By evening, everyone knew tent school collapsed. Children injured, Mary O'Connor pulling them from wreckage. The town's carefully controlled anger found its voice. "Built that opera house while kids learned in rags," men said in saloons. "Children hurt while he served champagne to investors," women said in mercantiles. "Knew this was coming. We all knew." Victor heard the news in his mine office from a supervisor who delivered it with undisguised contempt. "How many injured?" Victor asked. 8 children, broken arm, gashes, bruises, could have been worse. "I'll cover medical expenses." "Of course." The supervisor looked at him for a long moment. "That what you think this needs? Money." Victor bristled. "What would you suggest?" "Too late to suggest anything, sir. Mr. Prescott, you already chose." That evening, opera house attendance dropped to 12 people, less than a quarter capacity. The performers sang to near-empty velvet seats while the chandelier gleamed over absence. Victor walked home through streets where people turned away when they saw him, where conversation stopped, where contempt followed like cold wind. He told himself accidents happened, told himself he'd offered practical help, told himself he wasn't responsible for every problem in Silverton. Catherine came home hours after dark, dress muddy, chalk dust mixed with blood on her hands. She walked past him without speaking, went to her room, closed the door. Victor stood in his parlor, listening to silence, feeling something shift beneath his certainty. "I'm volunteering full-time at the school," Catherine said over breakfast. "Miss O'Connor needs help reorganizing in the church basement." Victor looked up from his newspaper. "That's Very charitable. My dear, appropriate for a young woman of a father. Stop. The quiet firmness in her voice made Victor set down the paper. Catherine's hands were wrapped around her coffee cup. Knuckles white. I'm ashamed. Catherine, I'm ashamed that I was educated in Denver while these children learn with nothing. Ashamed that my finishing school, my books and music lessons and French tutors all came from silver profits you wouldn't share with them. Her voice stayed level, but her eyes held tears. I'm ashamed to tell people you're my father. The words hit like physical blows. Victor felt his breath stop. Restart. That's not fair. The opera house serves the greater good. Catherine's laugh was bitter. The opera house serves your vanity, father. It proves you're sophisticated. It attracts investors who'll make you richer, but it doesn't educate a single child. You don't understand the economic complexities. I understand that Emma has a broken arm from canvas collapse, that Thomas needed 6 stitches in his forehead, that Mary O'Connor teaches with almost nothing while you host galas. Catherine stood. I understand perfectly. Victor felt his defenses rising, intellectual arguments about investment and civilization and long-term community benefit. All the reasoning that had seemed so sound, since so righteous. If you believe the opera house serves civilization, Catherine said quietly, come see what civilization actually requires. I don't need to. Please, father, her voice broke. Just come see. The crack in her composure undid him more than her anger had. Victor found himself nodding, following her out into February cold. Walking up the hill toward borrowed spaces where education persisted despite everything. The church basement was cramped and dark, lit by inadequate windows and smoking lamps. 20 children crowded into a space meant for half that number, sharing benches, sharing slates, sharing the 3 books Mary had salvaged from tent wreckage. Mary saw Victor enter but didn't acknowledge him. She simply continued teaching, her chalk-stained hands moving across a borrowed board, her voice patient despite exhaustion. Victor stood in the back, watching children share slates without complaint, watching older students teach younger ones multiplication using stones because they had nothing else, watching an 8-year-old girl explain arithmetic to her brother with the confidence of natural understanding. See, the girl arranged stones in groups. 3 groups of 4 makes 12, like this. Her brother's face lit with comprehension. I got it. Can I try? They were brilliant, Victor realized with dawning horror. Not charity cases grateful for scraps, not ignorant frontier children needing rescue. They were scholars intelligent, eager, creating education from poverty because education mattered to them. A boy read aloud from a damaged copy of The Last of the Mohicans, 3 others listening intently, pausing to debate character motivations with surprising sophistication. Another child showed him a geology drawing local formations rendered with scientific precision, labels in careful handwriting. Explained with vocabulary that would impress university students. At midday, when Mary released them for brief lunch, Victor approached her. She turned, waiting. I'd like to see your planning notes, he said. If you're willing to share. Mary studied him, then pulled out a worn notebook, page after page of rotation schedules, who shared which book when, slate practice timing, parent-volunteer coordination, systems built to maximize 3 books among 20 students, mathematics of scarcity. This is what we do with nothing. Mr. Prescott. Mary's voice held no accusation, just exhausted truth. Imagine what we could do with resources. Victor looked at the notebook and at the basement's inadequacy, at children eating lunches divided with mathematical precision, at Catherine's chalk-stained hands holding a slate while she worked with Emma, whose broken arm was splinted but whose eyes were bright with questions. He looked at his own hands, soft, clean, drawn to hands that signed checks and shook investors' hands and ran along imported velvet, hands that built monuments but not civilization. That evening, Victor stood in his opera house. Velvet seats stretched empty in rows. The chandelier caught gaslight and threw rainbows onto walls. The stage waited for performers who'd sing to diminishing audiences. He'd built this. Built elegance and acoustics and proof of sophistication. Built everything except what mattered. Catherine's words echoed. True culture begins with educating every child, not entertaining the elite. Victor picked up a piece of chalk someone had left on a lobby table, probably from the reading he'd suggested months ago. Forgotten now. The dust came off on his fingers, white against his skin. He'd never held chalk before, never dirtied his hands building civilization. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow I'll start fixing this. Victor returned to the church basement the next morning, unaccompanied. Mary looked up from teaching, surprise flashing across her face. "I'd like to observe," Victor said, "a full day, if you'll permit it." Mary nodded, returned to her lesson, no questions, no commentary, just continuation. Victor sat in the back, watching morning unfold, reading lessons where students helped each other sound out words, arithmetic where children explained concepts to younger siblings, science where a boy demonstrated basic chemistry principles using vinegar and limestone he'd gathered himself. They shared everything automatically: slates, books, even the light from windows. Positioning themselves so shadows didn't fall across each other's work, they'd built their own civilization from scarcity. These children built it with mutual aid and shared purpose and persistent hope. At lunch, Victor spoke with them, expected deference but found polite engagement instead. "Have you read The Last of the Mohicans, Mr. Prescott?" asked the boy who'd been reading aloud. "We're debating whether Hawkeye represents civilization or wilderness." "I think he's both." "That's quite sophisticated analysis," Victor said, genuinely surprised. "Miss O'Connor says good literature makes us think, not just read." The boy's pride was evident. "We only have one copy, but we take turns, then discuss." Another girl showed him her geology drawing, local formations rendered with scientific precision. "These are metamorphic rocks from the Silverton caldera," she explained, "transformed by heat and pressure, like people transformed through education." Victor felt something catch in his chest. Not charity cases, not ignorant children, scholars working with almost nothing, creating knowledge despite poverty. A small girl approached shyly. "Mr. Prescott, can you help me with these sums? Miss O'Connor's busy and Catherine's teaching Emma." Victor looked at the slate multiplication problems, carefully written. Yes, let me see." He worked through the problem with her, feeling chalk dust transfer to his fingers, seeing her face light when she understood. This was teaching, this simple exchange of knowledge, person to person, building civilization one multiplication table at a time. During afternoon lessons, Mary pulled him aside quietly. "These are my planning notes for next month." She showed him rotation schedules, resource allocation, parent-volunteer coordination. "This is what we do with nothing. Imagine with resources, books for every child, slates, a warm building, teachers who aren't stretched impossibly thin." Victor studied the notes, dense, practical, built from exhausted creativity. "You've created systems that would impress any administrator. Systems born from necessity, Mr. Prescott, not choice." He looked at her chalk-stained fingers, her worn dress, her eyes that held intelligence and dignity despite grinding circumstances. Looked at Catherine across the room, teaching with the same chalk-stained hands, the same quiet dedication. Looked at children learning despite everything, building knowledge from scraps, creating civilization while he'd built monuments. That evening, Victor stood in his opera house, walked through empty rows, ran hands along velvet that suddenly felt obscene, looked up at the chandelier crystal from Philadelphia, shipped with such care, installed with such precision, built while children drew with charred sticks, built while Mary patched frozen canvas, built while scholars made do with nothing. Catherine's voice echoed. True culture begins with educating every child, not entertaining the elite, but it was another voice he heard clearer now. Mary's exhausted truth. This is what we do with nothing. Imagine with resources. Victor picked up chalk again, felt its dust on his hands, understood finally what his dry hands had meant. Distance, separation from civilization's actual building. He'd written checks and signed contracts and supervised construction, but he'd never built anything that mattered. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow everything changes. He looked at his hands, white with chalk dust now, no longer clean, and felt something shift. Not punishment, not coercion, just recognition of what civilization required, and what he'd refused to see. March lights slanted through tall windows, catching dust motes that danced above rows of student desks. Victor Prescott stood in his opera house, but the space had transformed entirely, where velvet seats had lined the floor. Children now sat at proper desks, 30 of them, each with books and slates and space to learn. The stage had become Mary O'Connor's teaching area, her voice carrying with the acoustics Victor's architect had promised, but now carrying grammar lessons instead of Italian arias. The chandelier remained, crystal still catching light, but now it illuminated chalkboards instead of champagne glasses, bookshelves instead of evening gowns, children reading together instead of elite audiences. Victor hadn't groveled, hadn't made grand speeches about redemption. He'd simply acknowledged error and committed resources with genuine understanding. He'd hired 3 teachers, young women from Denver, who came for the promise of books and proper classrooms, and students who treated education like oxygen. He'd purchased books until the new shelves groaned readers, arithmetic texts, geography, literature, science. He'd ordered slates by the dozen, chalk by the box, everything Mary's careful notes had specified. The Opera House still hosted cultural events, but now they were children performing readings they'd written themselves, science demonstrations where students explained discoveries, musical instruction available to anyone, not just elite families able to afford private tutors, culture serving education, not replacing it. Mr. Prescott. A small voice pulled him from reflection. The girl he'd helped with multiplication stood nearby, and slate in hand. "Can you check my sums?" "Of course." Victor knelt beside her desk, working through problems, watching her face light with comprehension. His hands bore permanent chalk stains, now faint white marks that wouldn't wash completely clean no matter how he scrubbed. He didn't mind them anymore. Mary moved through the room with the confidence of someone finally given proper tools. Her chalk-stained fingers no longer looked like marks of deprivation, but signs of civilization's building. 3 assistant teachers worked with different groups. The sound of learning filling spaces designed for opera. Catherine taught at the far side of the room, working with older students on essay composition. She looked up, caught her father's eye, smiled. No words needed, just acknowledgement of shared purpose, shared work, shared understanding. The town's whispers had changed. Now people spoke of Prescott's school, of his transformation, of opera house acoustics carrying children's voices instead of imported performers. Some still held anger. Victor understood that, accepted it. Trust rebuilt slowly. Through action rather than apology, Thomas came by after school, forehead scar already fading. "Mr. Prescott, my father says to thank you. He can finally afford to keep me in school full-time since you're covering books and supplies." "Thank Miss O'Connor," Victor said. "She's the one who built this, long before I understood what building meant." Evening settled across Silverton. Students gathered their belongings, called goodbyes, scattered toward homes. Mary extinguished lamps methodically, checking each desk. Preparing for tomorrow, Victor helped her straighten the room chairs aligned. Slates stacked, books shelved. Simple work, but it felt more meaningful than any contract he'd ever signed. "The spring term registration is already full," Mary said. More statement than conversation. "We might need to add another teacher." "Then we'll add one." Victor placed the last chair. "Whatever the school needs." Mary turned to face him. "Why did you change your mind, truly?" Victor considered the question carefully. "I saw children creating education from poverty and realized I'd built nothing, just imported someone else's culture. Catherine helped me see that. And you showed me what civilization actually requires. Chalk-stained hands." Mary's lips quirked slightly. "Among other things." Victor looked at his own hands, permanently marked now. "I used to think culture elevated civilization, but you were right. Education creates it. Culture is what we build after everyone can read." Mary nodded slowly. "The opera house found its purpose." "It did." Victor looked around the transformed space. though I had to learn what purpose meant. They stood in the quiet room, civilization's builders both, hands marked by chalk, surrounded by evidence of genuine work. The chandelier glowed softly overhead, illuminating empty desks that would fill again tomorrow with children whose intelligence Victor had once overlooked while chasing sophistication. Catherine joined them, wiping chalk dust from her hands. "Father, some families want to know about summer reading programs. Can we keep the school open?" "Yes." Victor didn't hesitate. "Whatever serves the children. Then I'll tell Mary. We're thinking poetry and science both." She left to catch Mary before the teacher headed home. Victor stayed a moment longer, alone in the transformed space. Same building, same walls and windows, and that crystal chandelier from Philadelphia. But everything changed. Purpose found not through demolition but through understanding that culture without education was performance, that civilization built from literacy, not luxury, that dry hands needed chalk dust to truly build anything worthwhile. Outside, March stars emerged over Silverton's mountains, the town spread below. Lights twinkling in homes where children practiced letters learned today, where parents saw hope in proper schools, where civilization grew from education's foundation. Victor locked the door, felt chalk dust on his fingers, and understood completely. The opera house had found its purpose, not entertaining elite, but enlightening everyone, not monument to arrival, but foundation for continuation, not culture over education, but culture born from it. He walked home through evening cold, hands marked permanently by work that mattered, heart finally aligned with head, understanding that true legacy wasn't built in crystal and velvet, but in children's literacy, community knowledge, civilization shared. The whispers followed him different now. Redemption wasn't dramatic revelation, but quiet transformation. Purpose discovered through humility. Civilization built one chalk-stained hand at a time. Tomorrow, students would fill those desks again. Tomorrow, Mary would teach with resources instead of scraps. Tomorrow, Catherine would help younger children sound out words while Victor checked multiplication with others. Tomorrow, civilization would continue building itself not from imported culture, but from homegrown education, from shared knowledge, from every child given tools to learn. Victor reached home, washed his hands, saw chalk stains that wouldn't completely fade, and smiled. Some marks were meant to last, 3 out of 3.